So Randy, I'll start with you.
Okay, Wanda.
All righty, thank you, Jessica. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Baltimore City Monitoring Team's quarterly report. And this is our community time. We're going to spend time with you. And we have with us tonight, we have some special guests along with our normal guests. We have Ken Thompson, who is our main monitor for the consent decree. He's actually our lead monitor. We have Seth Rosenthal. Seth, you're there, aren't you? And he is our deputy monitor for Baltimore City. We also have with us, which is new, we have Chief Roberto Villasenor, and he served Tucson Police Department for 5 years. And he has served in every division and bureau of the department that included patrol, investigations, internal affairs, bike patrol, hostage negotiations, community policing, administration, and communications. I think he's done everything that could possibly be done in the police department. And then we have with us Dr. Randolph DuPont, Randy, and he is a national expert in law enforcement response to individuals that are experiencing mental health, substance abuse, and other behavioral crises. He has worked with the Memphis Police Department, and he helped them plan and develop the nationally recognized Memphis model for crisis intervention. He's helping here in Baltimore. We're working on mental health issues as well as youth issues. Welcome, Randy and Roberto. And I'm going to turn it over to Ken Thompson, who's going to actually introduce each of our panelists tonight. And we're going to ask that you put your questions in the chat. And we will be following up as after each individual speaks. But Ken is going to tell you more about that. Ken,
well, thank you, Wanda, and I'm not going to tell them much more because you've told them enough. And this is I'm happy to be here tonight with my teammates, in particular, Dr. DuPont, and I'm going to call him Taz because Villasenor takes too much to say. Might be water in front of me, but let me get right to the heart of the matter. As most of you who have participated in the past know, we attempt to give you kind of a backdrop description of what has happened in the past quarter in an effort to update you with respect to the process that BPD and the city are making in terms of complying with the consent decree. This is our first one for this year. And I'm really, again, happy to have not only Seth and Chuck, who generally join me, but having Taz and Dr. DuPont here, I think you're going to be very helpful. Update you with respect to the process that Chuck, who generally join me. We're getting a little bit of feedback from somebody. Can you fix that? But in any event, to move things along, this particular quarter, we have dealt with two subject matter areas that I think are of extreme importance. One is community policing. The other is how do you respond to folks who are having either a behavioral crisis or have some other behavioral disability. And those are the two subject matter areas that we addressed this quarter. I thought it was important to bring in another area that we haven't addressed yet, and we will address shortly, but it's really quite related to behavioral health, and that is how do police respond and intervene and interface with young people, with the youth. And I think those two areas, I think those of you in the audience will find that area helpful. The other thing that we hope to discuss tonight, assuming we have enough time to do it, those of you who read the newspaper last week saw where the Gun Trace Task Force independent report came out. And so I'm going to ask Seth to go through that, not in a great deal of detail, but in some summary fashion to give everyone in the community an opportunity to figure out and to hear from us in terms of how we think that report affects the progress that BPD is making again towards the road of compliance. So having said that, let me start with Dr. DuPont. Randy, I'll ask you to talk a little bit about behavioral health. And And as Wanda said, the way I would like this to proceed, because we have so many presentations this evening, I think it makes sense to have anyone who has questions, just send your questions into the chat room as you think through them and at the end of each presentation. But what we will do at the end of all the presentations tonight, we'll then do our best to answer your questions. So with that, without any further ado, Randy, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ken. I do appreciate it. And I appreciate the chance to talk to citizens of Baltimore. And we're kind of excited about where we are with the consent decree. I want to focus on kind of the importance of the phase we're getting into now with behavioral health. Let me first set a little background for you by talking a little bit about what we've done so far. We initially tackled with the community the challenge of working with changes in policy around how behavioral health events are responded to. BPD has done an excellent job of working with CPIC, which is our organization of community individuals, many of them people with lived experience, and some of those with their professional backgrounds who have volunteered their time to work again and work with BPD in a partnership. What we're finding is that we've developed some policies that people are regarding as very impressive and cutting edge, designed to try to change the way that interactions occur and what it is that how their outcome is impacted by the training that we're having. I think it's important too that we look at kind of the fact that we have done enormous training with officers. We've not only committed to fairly major amount of time in the initial academy work, but they also get in-service of 8 hours every year in addition to that initial 20 to 24 hours that they get in the academy. When you add that up over time, we're looking at some of the best trained officers in the country. But we've also moved to a phase where we're having crisis intervention training for those that really want to be leaders and leaders of events. And these officers are willing to volunteer without any extra pay, and they devote themselves to 40 hours of training, which is again, very, very impressive to what they're doing. What it's led to is again, where we have leadership, we're working again with officers who are going to be what they call CIT officers, and they're working with another program that has both officers and social workers, which is a co-responder program called CRT, or Crisis Response Team. This has been working very nicely. The data that we're getting is starting to look very encouraging with very low rates of arrests, and we're really pleased with those kind of outcomes. What we moved to after that was working again with the question of, can we provide adequate social service support for the officers in the street? It's one thing to have officers better trained, but they really need a place to refer people to and to ask and to see what kind of help is available in the community. To that extent, we're working with BCRI, the Baltimore Crisis Response Inc. group. They have been working hard to kind of take over and deal with a lot of those crisis events. And then we're looking forward to that only increasing over time. We are seeing data that suggests that the officers are calling the helpline more often to get assistance and to get advice. And I think that's outstanding. And I think that's only going to get stronger as we finish up with the CIT program and its training. But we're moving into what I would consider to be one of the more important phases right now. Is what we're looking at is working with the city and the mayor's program to really make a difference in the way that individuals are responded to mental illness, who have mental illness and mental illness events. And what they're doing is they're first starting with a change in the direction of the calls themselves. That is, they're looking at 911 calls and asking, can we bring more resources to help to bear? Can we direct those individuals that need help to the proper kind of help that they'll be able to get it? And we'll be able to then eventually make a difference. We're working a lot with the behavior BHSB, which is Behavioral Health System of Baltimore. They're working with the state. There's a program called GBRICS, and what that is it's coming together to make a difference in the infrastructure of mental health and the way people respond to it. The mayor has made major commitments to work with individuals who are homeless. That would include those that are struggling with mental illness and drug addiction, and will really help make a difference in allowing the police to be able to encourage people to those resources, but even begin to have resources that they can call upon without having to call on the police, to work with the new 988 system that's coming up, to work with the current H2H or helpline that's available, that's now moved to where they're handling 50,000 calls a year in the city of Baltimore. It's an enormous number of responses, and they're doing a good job with that. So we're really excited about it, because as we move to where the police are better trained, We're also moving to a system where it'll be better able to respond to the needs of those citizens of Baltimore. They'll be able to respond without the need to involve law enforcement and make a difference in the outcomes as we are starting to see now with our data collection. So Ken, just kind of a brief introduction. If there's anything further I can add, let me know.
Thank you, Randy. And I think that's fine for now. Taz, let me turn to you. And of course, one of the reasons why we wanted to discuss with the community both behavioral crisis and youth intervention is because they are related in a number of different ways, both in terms of training and in particular with respect to diversion. So, if you could just spend a few minutes, Taz, explaining to the public exactly what's happening with the department and the city, because the city is involved to a great degree in this aspect of the consent decree and how you see the progress through today. So I'll turn it over to you, Taz.
Thank you very much, Ken, and good evening, everyone. And Ken's exactly right. There are a lot of different approaches that are going on in dealing with youth and Baltimore Police response to youth. So what I'm very happy about and very excited about is the training that we're developing right now. The policies have already been developed and have gone out for community input and comment and returned, and then those were presented to the court. And now we're at the point where we want to implement those policies through a very robust training program and environment. And we've been doing a lot of our work along that. And what we're trying to get across to the officers is the developmentally different levels that children go through. And oftentimes, a lot of the issues that end up being interacting or causing interaction with police are as a result of some of these developmental issues that you go to. There's many studies, and I'm sure many of you have read this or heard about this, that a child's brain is not fully developed until the age of around 24, 25. So there's different stages that the youth go through that could determine their actions and how they're perceived by police, and also that police need to be aware of so that they can develop good techniques to connect with these kids. Because just being there and sternly telling someone to do something, even with adults, doesn't go over really well if you haven't made a connection, a communication connection with that individual. But now you add in the different things that kids are going through their growth development, and now sometimes it's really even more difficult to make that connection. They're still, developing their images of their self. They try to get their self-control, their judgment, control their emotions. They're looking at how to overcome issues of trauma, abuse, and there's just a variety of things that affect how they perceive the world around them, and particularly how they're going to be perceived by the world, especially the police officer. If an officer comes across someone and they're not able to communicate what they're going through, either because of their disability problems, such as Randy was talking about, or because of their age, or they're never taught how to regulate their emotions, or maybe their caretakers they were growing up also was undergoing mental illness themselves, and that's all they've been modeled under. These are things that some youth are going through that we have to make sure officers are aware of, and so that they can deal with those kids differently and develop tools to try and connect with the kids. In addition to the training that's going on in the areas of development and establishing relationships, we're also trying to deal with diversion topics to try and get these kids so it's not necessarily always into a punishment mode if they get caught doing, but maybe a rehabilitation or a development tool that can be used to help them with the issues they're facing. One of the programs then will be diversion and a program called Sidestep, which will try and get the kids into treatment or into a diversion away from the judicial system to deal with some of these problems. Usually that was done something after arrest. What the goal here now is to try and implement some of those diversion programs prior to arrest so that there's an alternative to arrest. Instead of getting an arrest and now putting on the youth, a criminal record, something that they're going to have to deal with as they grow up and later on in life, trying to get them into a diversion program to give them assistance and help in dealing with the issues that maybe caused some of the problems that ended up resulting in police being called into the situation. So it's a multi-pronged approach to try and help these kids and to help the officers who are dealing with the kids and behavioral health issues with adults and kids alike out in the community.
Thank you, Taz. That's a pretty good description, and I think it does help. It certainly helps me, and I hope it helps the folks in the audience to understand, first of all, the connection between the two, and the fact that the training that's been going on in many respects. I suspect you and Randy agree. You are putting out some of the same principles. Let me move on real quick. Is Chuck on the phone yet? Okay. Seth, you want to talk a little bit about the Gun Trace Task Force and how you see that impacting or intersecting with the consent decree?
Sure, thank you, Ken. So as Ken said at the outset, at the end of last week, Michael Bromwich, an independent third party, and a team of investigators published a very lengthy 500 and some odd page report on a root cause analysis of the Gun Trace Task Force. So what that team looked at was not simply the crimes that Gun Trace Task Force members and other Baltimore police officers, because the crimes were not just limited to Gun Trace Task Force members, but other police officers as well, the crimes that they committed, but all of the things that allowed that culture of corruption to flourish. And what that team found in essence, and it's hard to boil down a report that runs more than 500 pages in length, was that the reason those crimes were allowed to take place, the reason that they took place, was the result of a toxic combination of system failures at BPD, system failures that spanned some 30 years or more. You basically had an ineffectual system of supervision where supervisors, meaning sergeants and lieutenants, were not making sure that their charges were following the law. You layer on top of that a malnourished and disrespected and therefore ineffectual system of accountability, internal affairs function, so that when officers were going astray, there was nobody there, supervisors or internal affairs investigators there to keep them in line. And then you layer on top of that zero tolerance policing policies from the late 1990s and early 2000s that valued the quantity of arrests, not the quality of arrests, but the quantity of arrests and drug seizures and gun seizures above all else. And which means that if you had officers who were, and I'm using this word in air quotes, productive in that they generated a lot of arrests, or they generated a lot of drug seizures, or they generated a lot of gun seizures, you had supervisors and commanders essentially look the other way if they were breaking the law in the process, because they liked the results, they liked the statistics that were produced. And you had some, quite quote unquote productive officers like former Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, who headed up the Gun Trace Task Force ultimately, who were, making a lot of drug seizures, making a lot of gun seizures, making their commanding officers look good. And you had commanding officers, according to the findings of the investigation, essentially looking at the other way at long lists, long rap sheets of misconduct for these officers and other officers that went completely unaddressed. And so you had officers who were routinely engaging in violations of BPD policy, routinely engaging in violations of law, that BPD as an organization was not correcting, and was not only not correcting, but because it wasn't correcting it, was essentially giving to it stamp of approval. And that led to further corruption. It led to officers, as we all know, stealing drugs, stealing money from people, falsely arresting people, falsely accusing people of crime, and enriching themselves in the process. I'm not doing justice to the full report, but that in essence is what the report found. So the question is, well, how does the consent decree speak to this? And the consent decree speaks to each and every one of the system failures that this investigative team found. In fact, if you take a look at Commissioner Harrison's response to the report, you'll see that of the 25 recommendations that the investigative team made, Commissioner Harrison says that with almost each and every one of them, BPD, because of the consent decree, already has or has already begun to implement the recommendations. So the consent decree speaks to all of these system failures, from supervision to internal affairs to stop searches and arrests. And I don't want to go into those now. We're actually going to spend an entire day going over these things with the court on Thursday in our public hearing with him. But I do want to take one of the things that Mr. Bromwich and his team found and talk about how the consent decree addresses it and what's been happening under the consent decree to address it. So one of the things that Bromwich and his team found is that there was a culture of corruption that officers didn't even come to perceive as being inherently wrong. And that corruption was not in the nature of stealing things from the citizens of Baltimore. That corruption came in the form of fabricating facts in order to justify investigative stops, fabricating facts in order to justify searches, fabricating facts in order to justify arrests, and then including those fabricated facts in their official reports so as to justify what they had done. And then backing that up with false testimony in court in order to make the charges or those law enforcement actions stick. So that was not, what the gun trace task force scandal was about. That's not what grabbed the headlines. But according to Bromwich and his team, it was that culture of casual corruption, not venal corruption, that ultimately led to the crimes of the members of the gun trace task force and other Baltimore officers. It was basically an ends justify the means approach to law enforcement. Well, because there's a lot of violent crime out there, it doesn't really matter so much if we lie about the facts that support an arrest, as long as we believe that the arrest is justified because we think that the person who we're arresting actually committed the crime. So, one of the key areas in the consent decree is reform in the area of stop searches and arrests. It began with the reformation of BPD policies on stop searches and arrests. It continued with stop searches and arrest training that was performed department-wide and completed at the beginning of last year. And it's continued with the internal audit function at BPD, taking a look at the quality of arrests, and ultimately it's going to come down to the monitoring team also taking a look at the quality of arrests. When I talk about what BPD itself has done in its internal audit function to look at arrests, one of the things that the consent decree requires the internal audit function to do is to take a look at arrests that result in the people being arrested being released without charges when they're taken down to central booking, meaning that a duty prosecutor who's sitting there at central booking looks at the paperwork and says, nah, this is not good enough. This isn't going to stick. We got to set this person free. We're not going to even charge this person. And the way the consent decree was conceived, it was that these release without charge or RWAC arrests were determined to be a proxy for bad arrests that were made without probable cause. Now, as it turns out, they're not a perfect proxy for arrests made without probable cause, bad arrests, but they are a proxy. And over the course of the past year and a half, BPD's internal audit function has been conducting quarterly audits of these RWAC arrests. And what you'll see is the number of these RWAC arrests diminishing considerably, including in districts that saw a fair number of them at the beginning when the audits first began at the beginning of 2021. The fact that these RWAC arrests are diminishing considerably, and the fact that in the last 2 quarters, none of the RWAC arrests have been determined to be without probable cause, shows that the training that was conducted in early 2021, is beginning to have some impact, or at least that's what we hope. We as the monitoring team are now going to be taking a look behind that RWAC arrest analysis that BPD's internal audit function is doing. And we're also going to be taking a look at a statistically significant sample of arrests that were not R-Walk arrests in the coming months to determine whether, in fact, BPD is doing what the consent decree, what BPD policy and what the Constitution requires, which is to say making arrests that are supported by probable cause and supporting those arrests with adequate documentation, and not doing the kinds of things that Bromwich and his team found in their investigation, which is to say lying about the facts that make up arrests, and then putting those lies in their reports in order to make charges stick. So that's just one of the many, many things that the consent decree requires BPD to do to address the culture of corruption that Bromwich and his team found. There are a number of others, especially in the areas of supervision and internal affairs, but we'll leave that for discussion later on in the call.
So thank you, Beth. Chuck, I'm going to call on you next to talk a little bit about community policing. Let me just say this to the audience. You've heard from Chuck and Seth and I on a number of occasions during these quarterly these quarterly forums. And one of the things that we have said repeatedly is that one of the core purposes of the consent decree is to rebuild some level of trust between the community and the police department. And the three areas that we've discussed so far are really not that, and I would never say that they're any more important than anything else in the consent decree, because every provision in the consent decree is important. But these areas that we've discussed today, what Seth has talked about in terms of stop searches and arrests, what Taz has talked about in terms of how police respond to young people, and how Randy discussed how police respond to people who have disabilities or in crisis. What we're trying to get across, and what the consent decree is trying to do, is to get the police officers, when they interface with folks on the street, that they treat them in a fair and essentially a humane manner. And so I'm going to ask I'm going to ask Chuck just to spend a few minutes discussing the community policing area of the consent decree, because I think that really will give you a capsulation in terms of how we see how the police, will interact with folks on a daily basis. So Chuck, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ken. First of all, let me just say that one of the most important parts of the consent decree, in my opinion, is the area of community policing and community engagement. I mean, that's how trust is built. That's the foundation for quality service to the public. If you don't have trust, if you don't have lines of communication, then it's very difficult for everything else to really fall into place. BPD has made progress in this area. They have completed the training of their officers, actually looking now at refreshers that just to kind of make sure that people stay abreast of what's going on and connected with the whole concept of neighborhood policing. Commissioner Harrison has implemented something he did very successfully down in New Orleans, and that is developing those neighborhood policing plans, micro policing plans, where the concentration is in smaller geographical areas, building those relationships, focusing on the crime that's occurring in those areas and so forth. His goal is to get the entire department involved in community policing, understanding what community policing is all about, and building those relationships, particularly at the district level, but the entire department having a role in community policing. So, they're making progress. We're at the assessment point in a lot of areas in the consent decree, taking a look at whether or not the training actually had the desired impact. It has the engagement with community actually improved. Unfortunately, with COVID, whereas we thought we'd be back in the in-person meetings, in many instances still we're kind of virtual, which is what we're doing right now. But nevertheless, we don't want to wait. We want to continue to push forward because this is fundamental to change within the BPD, is developing these relationships with the community and being effective in dealing with crime and disorder issues. They can only do that through the partnerships and collaborations. So that's, I don't know if there's much more than that I can say, Ken. That's pretty much where we're at with it right now.
Thank you, Chuck. Wanda Miller, let's open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you, Ken. We have some good questions coming through here, so I will just take them in order. The first question that we had is, well, quickly, well, it's the second question. I'll take this one first. When is the next public hearing with the court, and what will be covered? I already posted a link to the hearing that will take place on this Thursday for the public.
That's right. The public hearing it starts at 1 o'clock, which is unusual. Normally they start at 10, but because the judge has a previous matter in front of him, the public hearing will begin at 1 o'clock, but it is on Thursday, the 20th, and it'll run until the subjects that are discussed are completed. And those would be what Seth just mentioned. A great deal of the time will be spent discussing the Gun Trace Task Force report, what we call the Bromwich report. There will also be a rather robust discussion with respect to integrity, which of course is the Public Integrity Bureau in the police department. And the third area that we expect to have some discussion would be on staff.
Okay. So our next question is, what is being done to reduce the trauma created by the recent reports concerning previous police behaviors and the length of time that is taking to implement the training of police officers?
Randy, you want to take a shot at that?
Well, I think, one thing that's true is that I think when one reads the reports, it's easy to become discouraged and to really to become quite concerned. I think what it also reflects is that there has been a history here of people who have struggled with issues and struggled with issues around the police. And we do know that has a significant impact. I think what we're seeing is a new day. And I think that's encouraging for those in the future. But I also think those that are still struggling with issues need to seek assistance. You're lucky in Baltimore. You have probably one of the more active crisis response lines I have seen in the country, that people the resources are available, that there's a number of issues there. So I would encourage people to seek that kind of assistance and help. But I do understand the legitimacy of what people are experiencing. And I do think that that's something that will be eventually, that wound will be healed over time, but it is going to take a little more time.
It is going to take time. If I can just jump in real quickly, because I just talked, briefly about community policing and community engagement. They've got a lot to overcome in Baltimore because of the history. And the report certainly highlights that. There's no question about it. I read the report and it was disheartening, to be honest with you. And even though, the individuals responsible have been arrested, convicted, and it doesn't matter. It's part of a larger problem that has existed in Baltimore for a period of time. And when we talk about building trust, this is the exact thing that erodes that trust. And it takes a long time for you to be able to rebuild it. The one thing I would hope, and that is that the residents of Baltimore, those that work in Baltimore, all the Baltimore stakeholders, give the commissioner an opportunity, a chance. I think the consent decree, in fact, I know the consent decree is a solid step in the right direction. We're looking at a lot of the very things that really, caused the problem to begin with. Lack of supervision, lack of training, all these kinds of things. But it's not going to happen overnight. You have full commitment. You've got a good commissioner in place who has embraced the report. He's not trying to argue and say, well, it didn't mean this, it didn't mean that. No, he's embracing it, and we'll put in place those mechanisms to make sure that the department is, moves in a totally different direction and rids its ranks of those people who would engage in that kind of misconduct and criminal behavior, but it takes time. And I know from experience, because I've taken over a couple of departments that have had similar issues, it does not happen overnight. And so if people have to be realistic as well in terms of just how fast, but they should already begin to see some change in the department in terms of the engagement, the training, those kinds of things, the leadership, all those things matter. But this is devastating. I mean, there's no other way of describing it. It is devastating, but it can be overcome. It can be overcome. There's no question about that. People need to understand that and not be afraid to report any acts of misconduct. Because if we don't rid our ranks of the individuals who do those kinds of things, put in place safeguards and systems that will make it very difficult, if not impossible, for officers to engage in that kind of behavior. And that's part of what's being built now. But you have to give it a little bit of time. But again, it is a setback, I think, for not just Baltimore, but actually law enforcement in general, because I think people are reading that report outside of Baltimore. And we're in an era now and an age where what happens in one jurisdiction affects other jurisdictions as well. So these are lessons learned for everyone in law enforcement across the country, not just Baltimore.
If I could also jump in on this a little bit, that's absolutely true. But also, I think what Seth touched on earlier in his comments, in what led to some of this, was a lack of accountability and also poor training. And I'm also involved in use of force, the stop, search, arrest that Seth was talking about, in transport. As a result of being involved in those areas, I've also been involved in the development of the training and then watching the training. Baltimore early on decided that they were going to move away from the old standards of training that police have gone by through decades of a lecture type training, but get more of an effective training that gets the message across, use adult learning principles, and work things through scenario-based training. And I'm watching this because I also go and I'll just sit there and observe the training. It's been virtual since COVID started, but before that, I would go to the classroom, watch the training that takes place, watch the interactions with the officers. And you see a lot of the discussions that take place there go to the heart of the matter, the meat of the matter. And I've seen the instructors come right out and say, we're here because of our conduct. We're here because we messed up and we did things wrong, and we need to own up to that. We need to take that over. And I'm glad to see that they are doing that and engaging in those conversations with the officers. And quite often from the class, oftentimes you will hear people challenge people who try and deny that. And there's been some very spirited, very good conversations between students and instructors taking place in this training. So it's difficult at times to hear you're doing things wrong, you did things wrong, you need to change. But I'm also very encouraged when I watch Baltimore and the officers there accept that and try and move on to it. I'm not going to sit here and blow smoke and say everyone is, wonderfully and on board with everything, because it does take time to change the heart of an organization. And that old saying, the great thing about old sayings is that they've been around a long time, usually because they're true. It takes a long time to change a big ship's direction. And Baltimore's a big ship in the world of policing. And it's going to take a long time to move them around, but it's going to take consistent, concerted effort to get them there. And I'm sure it can be accomplished.
There's one other thing that I just neglected to mention, and I think it's relevant because part of the conversation that's being had right now is around staffing. And part of the problem in the past has been poor hiring practices, a promotional process, a reward system, and the way in which people are evaluated. All those things are things that are being looked at. And so I know that the department is short, but, again, don't just look at numbers, look at the quality of individuals that are being brought into the organization. That's what's important. And that takes some time, but you got to weed out some folks, and you start by not bringing new ones in that could be problematic in the future. So hiring, staffing, all those things are important. So it's everything coming together. It's all the pieces of the puzzle, accountability, supervision, all those kinds of things, and taking action on the little things that occur, not just wait for the big issues of misconduct and so forth, dealing with it before it becomes a huge problem. All those things are important.
So, you know, what's interesting, that's such a great question because it points out a number of different things. And all of you guys have talked about essentially the culture or the culture in this department that is.
But you have to give it a little bit of time.
Right.
But
It takes.
again, it is a setback, I think, for not just Baltimore.
No, I agree with you. But my point is, when I look at what Seth has indicated, and I try to look in terms of what progress is being made. And again, you know, there's a lot of work left to be done. But if you look at the training that the monitoring team has been, you know, quite active in helping the department develop its curriculum. And when you look at some of the results that we're beginning to see in the grain, again, it's just anecdotal. And we're at the point now where the monitoring team is about to do the comprehensive assessments that'll take the next year or so to get done. But what we're beginning to see is we're seeing progress. And one of the things that Seth mentioned when he was talking about the arrest without charges, I mean, you're seeing fewer and fewer situations where people are being arrested now without probable cause. So, you know, I think it's going to take time, and it obviously is going to take time for this to get to the point where we want it to get to. But I think we are seeing progress, and we're certainly seeing things moving in the right direction.
Okay, well, I think we can move on. Thank you all for responses to that question. The next question I think is for you, Seth. Someone just wants to clarify that the data for incidents from 2018 through 2020 will not be in a report form until the end of 2022.
So the data for what? So there are a few different things going on, right? So there's a use of force report or use of force analysis that we ourselves are doing right now, covering that period 2018 to 2020. Our objective is to have that published by the spring. So if we're talking use of force, that analysis of a statistically significant sample of use of force cases will be published by this spring, covering that period. If we're talking about arrests, we're going to be taking a look at a statistically significant sample of arrests between the years 2019, prior to training, through 2021. So it straddles the period of stop searches and arrest training and then concentrates on the period after training. We're about to begin that assessment in the next month. We're actually having a methodology discussion with DOJ, Department of Justice, and BPD on Friday about it. Hopefully we'll nail down the methodology and we'll begin that assessment shortly. We're hoping to get that report out probably a little bit after the use of force report. So that's on arrests. If we're talking about BPD's own reports, so BPD produces reports every quarter on these release without charge arrests. The most recent one was published, I think, in the middle of last month, middle of December. But if you go to BPD's website and its transparency page, you can see those release without charge or RWAC reports. BPD is also doing a comprehensive analysis of its use of force cases from 2017 to 2020. That should be published by the end of March. So those are a bunch of different reports, including data on arrests and use of force. And I'm hoping that somewhere in there answered our participants' question.
Thank you, Seth, and I'll keep an eye out to see if there's follow-up. In the meantime, I'll go on to the next question. And the question is, the poster was wondering if the consent decree monitoring team had any reaction to Baltimore Police Department's statement and the lack of a crisis team input before BPD officers decided to make contact with Mr. Coe. This is involving the incident that took place on Christmas Day when a BPD officer shot Baron Coe, and it was released, at least according to this post, that there was not a crisis response team present, and someone from the BPD's Public Integrity Bureau said after the shooting that he didn't think it would have made a difference had the crisis team been consulted. So I'll just turn that over to the group right now.
Let me start, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Randy. We don't do assessments piecemeal. I mean, the bottom line is what we will do. We'll certainly look at that at the appropriate time, and it'll be, and I'm certain we will discuss it perhaps in one of our semi-annual reports. But it's certainly going to be part of the consideration that we look, or the considerations we look at when we assess what the department is doing with respect to use of force, and perhaps even in the area of behavioral health. But Randy, I'll turn that over to you.
I know one of the things that they're working on with the Baltimore Crisis Response Group is to kind of identify, based on 911 calls, when it makes the most sense to respond and when there is a public safety issue to consider. So I know that those things are being considered and looked at. I do think it doesn't help to talk about what would change differently when we're dealing with such a tragic event. And I know I'm sorry for the family and those that are struggling with these issues, but I do think that it's important as we look at these the events and what we're dealing with, to be able to look at the change that is occurring on the part of BPD, and the fact that they are diverting into calls directly to the helpline and other things of that nature. So again, while I know that it's a tragedy, and I don't think we should underplay the sadness that are involved in this event, we do need to look at the issue of what kind of issues are happening from a standpoint of treatment. Are people being referred at the proper time? Are they being able to get help? And is that help responsive and being able to prevent these tragedies from becoming something that reaches the level that reached? Thank you.
I just wanted to mention Commissioner Hammond's response to the Bromwich report has been added to our chat if anyone would like to make a copy of the link, so that they'll be able to read that prior to tomorrow's hearing, Thursday's hearing. I don't see any other questions right now. Do you have any, Miller?
Scroll real quick.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for providing your email address. We have one from one of our neighborhood liaisons, and she's asking the group, what do you think? Do you think that BPD officers are warming to and accepting the consent decree? What is your vision? What's your view?
Seth, I'll turn that over to you. I mean, it's a hard question to answer accurately, because I think it would take data. And one of the things that we would certainly look at would be the surveys that we do, not only with the community, but which is done by Morgan State University, but also the surveys that we do with the police department. So, while I think that there are many police officers who have warmed up to it, I think it's premature for me to say one way or the other until we see a little more data. Seth, you may have a different response, and Chuck, you should chime in as well.
I'll just provide one of those data points, Ken, the one that we know of, and that is that at the end of every consent decree mandated training, BPD provides officers a survey to gauge the training, to gauge its effectiveness, to gauge whether there are lessons learned, to gauge whether it taught BPD officers policy in a way that can be applied on the street. And the overwhelming majority of BPD officers, for every single training that's been offered under the consent decree, gives favorable responses to the training. Says that the training is effective, says that it gives them what they need to do to carry out their responsibilities on the street, and says that it's engaging. All officers know, but for most of the trainings, if not all of the trainings, we're talking about 80% plus of officers who respond with those type of, favorably in that way. And this ranges from the first consent decree mandated training on use of force to the next big consent decree mandated training on stop, searches, and arrests, to the training on community policing. The training on responding to reports of sexual assault and behavioral health awareness was particularly well received. And then there have been specialized training on misconduct investigations for Public Integrity Bureau detectives. Believe it or not, the first in recent memory that was ever delivered, and was very well received. Training for sex assault investigators, also very, very well received. So if we're talking about an important data point about officer receptiveness to the consent decree, officers like the training that's been conducted under the consent decree. I don't know that we have additional data points that we can latch onto. I will say that this coming spring, we are going to conduct our second set of officer focus groups. The first set was conducted at the very beginning, and there were mixed responses, mixed reactions to the consent decree there. But we'll see if there's been a sea change or any change at all in officer receptivity to the consent decree when we conduct these focus groups this spring. And we'll have a report out sometime this summer on officer feelings about the consent decree.
Okay, we
Okay,
have about 8 minutes left. Go ahead, Miller.
Oh, and I was just going to say thank you. I don't see any other questions in the thread there. Ms.
If
Wanda, did you have
anyone
any
would like
that you
to-
got ahead?
I've looked through, I think I've gone through all of mine. We got about the same, I believe.
Well, if I could comment then a little bit on what Seth was talking about there in that last question. My feeling on that, will you get everyone on board? No, you won't. But I think what I'm encouraged about is that also BPD is putting in place the accountability systems, because whether they're on board or not, they're going to have policies and rules that they're going to have to follow. And if we can get the supervisors and the lieutenants on board, that's the biggest accomplishment, because they're going to be the ones that are going to be holding the line officers accountable to the policies and regulations that are being put in place. Now, those policies are being developed with the help of DOJ, the monitoring team, and the community. They're being provided opportunities to provide input on what they feel are good policy changes. Those are being published, they're being put through the court process. When those are in effect and training is provided, officers are held to those standards. And whether they agree with what is going on or not, I think is going to be second to whether they will abide by the policies, and that's important. I do feel like what Seth say, we're getting great responses on the training. So I think that a lot of them are warming up to the consent decree, and also what Chuck said earlier, it matters who you hire. And now within the hiring process, we're looking at the issues of the changes in BPD and the policy. So we're bringing people on board that will be predestined to try and go with those changes. So I believe in the long term, BPD will accept this, but I think that the accountability structures are very important, and they're being put in place to make sure that everyone conducts themselves appropriately.
One of the things that I don't think that Baltimoreans know about is the fact that the BPD they did not have an integrated computerized system, a record management system, which we do have now, which will make a world of a difference in accountability, because they have to now adhere to the regulations, and they have to make sure that the forms are filled out correctly now. So we're going from a paper system to an automatic system. Anybody like to espouse on that? I know some things about it.
Well, that is accurate. The system is called Axon Records, and it's an automated reporting system. And actually, the nice part about that, BPD is one of the largest agencies in the country that will be using Axon Records. And so they're very adaptable. Well, what word am I trying to look for? They're very adaptable as to what they can develop within this system that helps meet the needs of BPD. For example, when someone is arrested and transported, there's certain issues that need to be tracked per the consent decree. Axon Records has developed a form that will help them capture some of that information automatically. So things of that nature, where now information where before it'd have to be strenuous, time-consuming manual searches to gather the information needed, will be much easier to do. And also we can make sure that the proper information is being captured through drop-down menus and selecting switches, which officers have to complete before they can submit a report. So I think it's a huge step forward technologically wise to accomplish some of the mandates of the consent decree.
And on a related topic, when you look at the early intervention system, which is not yet in place, but it's being worked on. And what we mean by that, when you have the right data, a good supervisor should be able to review his or her data sheets on a frequent basis. And when you have a police officer who is, having repeated issues that raise some concerns, if you can pick that up early on, sometimes it's just a matter of giving that officer some counseling. Sometimes it means, as Chuck indicated, the person should not have been hired in the first place, and they need to be separated. And then there are all kinds of things in the middle. But that's one of the big deals about the technology, because it does, and it will give BPD an opportunity once it's in place to be able to identify, those officers who may be having some problems and who could use some help, and in some cases who may need to be separated from the department.
I know in the past it would take almost 2 to 3 weeks to get a police report, so this will help alleviate that as well, so that citizens can get the information that they need in a timely fashion now. And we have about another minute or two. Would anybody like to say some? No, you have actually 3 minutes to say something in closing. Seth? Randy, do you have anything you'd like to wrap up with?
Yeah, I want to make one quick comment on the data input. I know at one point when we arrived, they were entering things by hand onto spreadsheets, and it was taking them hours. So I do know that they're very excited about the fact that new data is being collected on a large department-wide basis without that kind of level. The other thing I'd like to quickly add is that, folks, what I'm excited about is seeing the volunteerism. When we needed leaders for intervention issues with behavioral crisis events, we were concerned. Officers can express their dislike of things by not volunteering, but they are volunteering, and we're filling up the classes. So we're excited about that.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Anyone else have anything they'd like to say in closing?
I just want to thank the audience for, again, providing great questions and participating. I mean, this process is only going to work if we get good cooperation from the community. We need their input. We need their responses. We need their complaints. We need when they see good things happening, we need to know about that, just like we need to know about bad things. So again, I want to thank the folks who took some time out of their evening, to spend some time with us. And I really thought the questions were excellent this evening.
Okay, we have about another minute. Miller, can you put in the chat room our website information real quick, so that if people like to reach out to us with questions, there are places on our website where you can enter your information, and you can also go to our website as well as BPD's website to look at the new policies and procedures, because we do need public comments on these. So we need people to stay engaged with us, and invite your friends and your neighbors who may not even know that they can participate in the consent decree process. And again, I'd like to thank our audience, and I'd like to thank our panel members, especially our 2 new ones. Thank you for being with us, and we will be calling on you again. So thank you. Jessica, you're going to take us out?
No.
Good night, everybody.
Do you have something?
Night, everyone. Thank you so much. We've put up our email address at info@bpdmonitor.com. We've also put up our website. Please feel free to reach out to us if you need anything further. We'll be happy to help. Have a great night, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.